what I want to do now is become a little bit more specific about some of the dimensions of what we call new learning. This is just a list of about 8 or so changes that are going on in the realm of education. So this is a more finely grained list than the one I started off with at the beginning. So, in a way, it partly summarises what I've been saying as well. So the socialist living of education, it's recognised that education is more important than ever. Knowledge economy, knowledge society, parents worrying about the futures for their children and putting a huge amount of effort into, directing a lot of effort into those children succeeding. That's one environmental change that we need to take into account. A second change is an institutional change in the locations of learning. So, it used to be you go to school and then you go off and do a job, but school is the time and the place for formal learning, and the idea of school is that you learn most of what you need for most of life in the sense of formal education. Firstly, literacy, mathematics, and then education which specifically related to a trade or a profession or whatever. Now, learning is kind of happening everywhere. It happens in, technology's moving on. It happens in workplaces all the time. Perhaps it's training in workplaces. Perhaps it's, so in other words, learning becomes a lifelong thing, but also learning becomes a life-wide thing. A lot of what we're learning about how to operate in the world, how to use new media, how to use computers, nobody teaches us formally. It's because these systems have inbuilt pedagogical structures in them. They have little help menus, they have tutorials, they have little pop-ups. So in fact, they are pedagogical spaces. So the institutional locations of learning are being broadened, and in a way, formal institutional education is becoming relatively less significant in terms of the total quantum of what we have to know in life than what it was in the past. The third big change is in the tools of learning, which I've mentioned already. The media are changing in some quite profound ways. I hope we'll explore that more further on, but it's essentially around computer-based computer technologies, not just for delivery of content, but forms of interaction like games and simulation, but also the spaces in which students do their work, the way they represent their knowledge, and the way their knowledge is assessed too. All of those things are changing. The media is changing. The fourth area is the outcomes of learning, the intended outcomes of learning. That's been transformed as well. So historically in modern education, in mass institutional education, the outcomes of learning were things that you could remember, knowledge that you'd acquired, things that could be attested. But there's a kind of a shift now to not just things that can be remembered because you can look them up if you want to, but capacities to do. Skills, adaptability, not just application. So this is really a shift in emphasis in what the intended outcomes of learning might be, the kinds of outcomes that we're talking about. The fifth area is a phrase that we use called the balance of agency. So, this is what the typical modern world was like. In the workplace, there was the boss and the supervisor who gave me orders or passed down memos, and I did what I was told. In modern states, I was conscripted to fight in wars. They were relatively, either they were totally authoritarian or they were pretty strongly directive about the way you lead your life. And in the media, in everyday popular culture, there were 2 or 3 television channels, and we sat down at night and we watched them, or we had the newspaper delivered to our front door and we read the newspaper, and there was a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper. So as people who were engaged in the culture, we were relatively passive recipients of stuff that was presented to us by reporters, by experts, and the like. Now what we have is, Wikipedia is not written by experts, it's written by anybody who knows something about something and can go and put that in there. That when we do new media, we're as much creators of that media as we are consumers of that media, and we do the creation at the same time as the consumption. When we play a video game, we are actually a character in that game in a way that we weren't when we were watching a sitcom on television and we related only vicariously to one of the characters. We weren't that character, but in a game, we are that character. So everywhere in this world that we're in now, there's a shift in the balance of agency from a kind of control and command society to one which is much more interactive, much more dialogical. Now, it's not much more equal, and it's not a happy place, and it's environmental disaster. So I'm not trying to say nirvana's been achieved by any means, but there has been this very interesting shift in the balance of agency. Now, let's go to school. Traditional school, teacher stood at the front, the textbook said what you're supposed to remember. You did the test to check that everything was okay and that you had been a good compliant person, knowledge compliance, if you like, knowledge command, knowledge compliance. Now, if we don't shift the logic of what we do in schools to learner engagement, learners as knowledge constructors, learners as active knowledge makers, if we don't do that, we're out of step with a larger set of cultural shifts that are happening in the world around us. So that's what we mean about some big changes that new learning prompts around this idea of the balance of agency. My sixth point is about the significance of learner differences. I think I've mentioned that already. The kind of pretense of modern schooling was one size fits all. This textbook's good enough for everybody. Some kids will do well and some won't do well at it, but that's the way the world is. It's called, the bell curve and inequality. But now learner differences are really significant, and we're doing things like personalised instruction, individualised instruction, self-paced learning, on-demand learning. So we're actually building structures which are more capable of taking on board learner differences, but also spaces where learners are more capable of expressing who they are in terms of their identity, male and female, one culture and another culture, gay and straight. In other words, these are spaces where expression of voice and identity, which was kind of ignored and forgotten, or we pretended it didn't exist in that old schooling. This is something where when students are more active knowledge creators and when they're producing things, those differences become more visible. My seventh point is, one of the funny things about this moment is that it's very, very complex. So I'm going to, over the next series of videos, we're going to characterise the differences between didactic pedagogy, which is the patterns of pedagogy in early modern education, the rise of what we call authentic pedagogy, really most notably at about the turn of the 20th century, people like John Dewey, Maria Montessori, and then the rise of new learning, which kind of begins with critical pedagogy and now is completely caught up in new media and active knowledge making and using new technologies in learning. So we're going to characterise that new learning. However, one of the interesting things about this moment is that we have the most didactic of pedagogies in machine-based assessment. We have in the flipped classroom with videos a replication of the teacher lecturing and the student listening. So the irony is that in this moment we have this complex mixture of the new and everything of the old being reproduced in the new, right? So one of the interesting things about this moment is that this is much more complex in terms of the variety of modes, of pedagogical modes that are all mixed up together. And in fact, some of these pedagogical modes the old ones, the didactic ones, may still be of strategic value. So it's a complex moment where we don't want to dismiss any pedagogical mode, and perhaps what we need is a holistic mix of pedagogical modes. But the only thing I can say is that it sure is much more complex. And finally, the eighth point here in this list of dimensions of new learning is the professional role of the teacher. So the professional role of the teacher is changing in really, really profound ways. So when students become more active learners, when we have much more formative assessment, which is this teacher just doesn't give all the assignments back at the end of the whenever with an A+ on them and a few comments, that when they're involved in formative assessment, when we're building collaborative learning environments where there's much more structured peer-to-peer interaction, when we're using new media, when sometimes the learners are more on top of these technologies than the teacher, and the teacher has to cede a certain degree of control to learners as agents in this process. The professional role of the teacher is really, really changing, and that actually in some ways is one of the biggest challenges because it involves a real change in legacy professional practices.